When you think of a battleship, you almost certainly think of big guns and heavy armor. The Battle of Jutland or the shore bombardment in the Pacific. That's what these ships were designed for after all. Fighting other ships or hitting targets ashore. Although the second option was, admittedly, not really the intention at first. On the other hand, you probably don't think this is a yacht. After all, it seems counterintuitive, and yet that did happen, more often than it may appear. Because while royal yachts were a thing, royalty would sometimes take a battleship as well. The most famous example being HMS Vanguard. However, Vanguard was not the only example, and certainly not the first in the Royal Navy. In this Redux video, we'll look at a couple ships where this happened, a redone version of one of my earliest videos, and we'll begin with one of the earliest battleship yachts, that being the darling of one Jackie Fisher, HMS Renown. Not the later and far more famous battlecruiser, but a second-class battleship that did shape Fisher's later ideas. This was a fast ship for her day, considered beautiful and quite efficient, not to mention filled with innovative technology for the time, such as being the first battleship armored with Harvey steel, allowing for a thinner belt for the same protection, alongside a sloped armored deck matched by casement armor, as well as newer model turrets. However, for all these innovations, technology is always marching on. Renown was commissioned in 1897, by which point more advanced ships were on the horizon. Moreover, she had been designed as a second-class battleship, one intended to lead cruiser squadrons on foreign stations. This had led to a very fast speed when she was designed, that being 19 knots. This would remain quite fast by pre-Dreadnought standards. Unfortunately, it was less than a decade until HMS Dreadnought made that look slow. As a result, Renown's innovations came to nothing for the ship. She never saw combat. Instead, the ship became something of a social darling. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. At the time, it was expected that a flagship be used to host social events. There was nothing particularly notable about this for HMS Renown, aside from Fisher's fondness for his ship, a fondness that would influence his later fascination for lean and fast capital ships. However, while Fisher's use of Renown was pretty typical, this would change. In 1902, Renown was becoming obsolescent as a frontline warship. Larger pre-Dreadnoughts were better fit for combat duty, and Dreadnought herself was only a couple years out. So Renown was put in refit after she returned home to Britain in October 1902. Not to increase her combat capability, but to convert her into a massive royal yacht, specifically to carry Prince Arthur and his wife to India on a royal tour. This entailed removing most of her 6-inch secondary battery, as well as conversions of her internal spaces. The officer cabins became royal suites, while the casements, now empty of weaponry, became officer quarters, in addition to a new paint scheme, predominantly white, but featuring a green waterline, along with dark yellow funnels and red on the bow sheer. All of this work earned her the nickname Battleship Yacht. This first royal tour lasted from November of 1902 through March of 1903. Renown was, as it turned out, put back into service with the Mediterranean Fleet when the tour was finished. Still missing much of her secondary battery, but she was back in military service. For a time. Nonetheless, the ship was put in reserve in May 1904. By this point, Renown was increasingly outdated. so it shouldn't be terribly surprising that the British used her as a yacht for a second time. It was done once, so it was simpler to refit her again. This began in February 1905 and saw the remaining secondary battery removed in favor of more cabin space. This time she left in October of 1905, carrying the future King George V, at the time the Prince of Wales, on another tour of India that concluded on May 7th, 1906. Renown went back into reserve, now firmly entrenched as a yacht. In fact, her role had her officially designated a subsidiary yacht. This would see her carry King Alfonso of Spain in 1907, the last of her royal voyages before Renown was put in complete reserve. She would see no more long-distance voyages and was ultimately decommissioned in 1913, before being scrapped in 1914. That rounds off HMS Renown. Now let's move to the other end of battleship history, from one of many pre-Dreadnoughts to the last battleship of the Royal Navy. Remember how I mentioned HMS Vanguard being the best known example of this topic? That is for good reason. Vanguard is generally known for a couple things. Being the last British battleship is, of course, the big one. You might also know how her service was cut short or how she carried antique weaponry. That said, looming large over all of this was her use as a royal yacht. This is not surprising. Vanguard was pulled into refit almost immediately after she entered service, and I do mean that literally. Vanguard was commissioned on May 12, 1946. She would have a few months of sea trials and working up before going back into dock in August of the same year, for modifications to serve as an utterly gargantuan royal yacht. This saw the anti-aircraft battery on top of B turret replaced by a saluting platform, with the admiral quarters refit to royal quarters. When this was done, Vanguard was sent on a tour of South Africa for King George VI from February 1947 until May. There were plans for 2 other cruises as well, one to Australia and New Zealand in 1949, and another planned for 1952, this time for King George's health, which was rapidly failing him. Neither of these cruises went through. The first was cancelled because of the King's ill health. The second was cancelled because King George died, which does, of course, mean that Vanguard was only used for one royal tour. What began with Renown would end with Vanguard, from a pre-Dreadnought to the last of Britain's battleships. Still, it's weird to think about massive battleships being used as royal yachts, no matter how you cut it. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.